All right, so for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to have a discussion amongst the three of us. I'm going to pose some questions to Joe and Michael about their keynote presentations. And by the way, thank you both for them. They were amazing. So, and then we'll obviously have time for questions from all of you. But we'd like to keep this discussion more open. So if you have questions for one another, now that you've seen each other's presentations, please feel free to do so, to address one another directly. Let me start off, both of you touched upon the idea of behavior change. And one thought, Michael, you and I were talking about this briefly. You had the research in East Germany, the research in Africa, but what was the genesis for you of pursuing this path of personal initiative as opposed to traditional business practices?
Thank you. I became a visiting professor in Africa at the same time when reunification in Germany happened. And in a way, suddenly things collapsed for me into what is it that needs to be done. But it took me a long time, quite frankly. So I came to Africa naive like hell. Okay, that was a long time ago. You were not born then, most of you. At that point in time, I said, what can I professionally, as a psychologist, do to reduce poverty? And I tried everything. So I talked to CEOs, I talked to HR professionals, I suggested this and that. And in essence, I was convinced that psychology had nothing to say. And then I suddenly noticed that I had overlooked the vast majority of people, namely those guys who develop value in a society, and it was entrepreneurs. And once I started to do research on entrepreneurs and started to use the type of scale development that I had used in East Germany, that it really became very clear that there were lots of stuff that was behaviorally going on. And of course, to be quite honest, it's psychology, that's the science of behavior. Just on a side, okay? Economists tend to not believe that. But then I said, yeah, I can actually at least study it. And so I studied it for a long time. And then I noticed that it wasn't so bad. The hypothesis turned out to be quite correct in terms of regression analysis. And then I became more and more interested in interventions. So I started the intervention about 20 years ago, 18 years ago, to actually really work on them. And first, of course, I made all the mistakes in the world. I didn't do randomize, all this nonsense, that one does when one is naive about things. So it was good to be reminded again and again that you had to be really, really tight with the method and really broad in your thinking.
Joe, to add to that point.
Yeah, and Michael, yes, of course, psychology is a science now that you've co-opted the Nobel Prize in economics. And economics, as we know, is a science. But I think for me, it's been really interesting to see as to how, and this is to Michael's point, economists traditionally, before Kahneman and Tversky came along, and Thaler and the others, did not thought of psychology as this, voodoo science, oxymoron. But essentially, there was very little acceptance of this overall idea that you needed to look at psychology, and then the world changed. But in my own practice, evaluation practice, and working with a lot of the multilateral organizations, I think the frustration was that more people weren't thinking about it. So like I was we were looking at we built an entire body of work around humanitarian crisis, and then my training is in agriculture, but also realizing that smallholder farmers work very differently, like I said, even though the economist sitting in the room thinking, of course you've got to think rationally. I mean, why wouldn't you adopt the agricultural insurance package that's been given to you? And this rational thinking and irrational thinking, and clearly, men are from Mars and everyone else is from Venus, but this distinction or this differentiation was very, very big. Quick anecdote, when I came to the GCF and I started to think a lot more about climate change, I started to try to look at where climate change interventions had looked at insights from psychology. And there were zero. There were zero studies that had looked at, and then I called up Dean Carlin and a few others and said, okay, do you know? And then they put me in touch with a few studies, but I essentially had to call up professors in the United States and in Europe to say, can you please tell me, and these, because my community is that of economics, I had to call economists that I knew who then helped me snowball and get in touch with psychology professors who were working in this space. But I had to also look at very different journals. Yeah, that kind of work doesn't get published traditionally in economics journals, and which is what I was reading. So I think this divide needs to be bridged in a far more salient way.
And actually, it's funny, as I listen to your journey through this process, Joe, it talks a great deal to what Michael was saying about personal initiative, because you had to build this all yourself. You had to make these connections. We spoke in your presentation, or you spoke a great deal in your presentation about the importance of RCTs, of randomized controlled trials, and you touched upon some of the myths that we still live with in development work in general. But there are also quite a few myths that persist around RCTs. The idea that they're expensive and they're difficult to check. What are some of those common misperceptions about RCTs, and what is the real truth around them too?
Ooh, okay. So actually we just wrote a paper and it's come out as a learning paper in this space. So one myth is that, RCTs, and let me dispel one of them very quickly, that RCTs can be used for everything. They cannot be. Yeah, there's definitely the problem of large N, and you need to be able to randomly assign. But I think there are other myths that go along with RCTs that I've had to personally do seminars, workshops, trainings, do posters, do all sorts of innovative communication campaigns around, both internally within GCF, but also externally with a whole lot of organizations such as WFP, IFAD, DFID, etc., which is that RCTs are expensive, they take a lot of time, and in the end, they don't have a lot of impact. So let me take each one of them very quickly, Michael. So first, that they are expensive. And the patent question I get asked when I'm sitting on a panel is, well, how much do they cost? And my answer is, well, it depends. They could go from $20,000 to $2 million or $5 million. I mean, Yahoo and Google use control trials every day in real time, and they don't spend an additional dollar, basically, to understand the force of their evidence. So you can do this in a day. You can do an RCT in a day. But in development interventions, which is where a lot of these agencies are coming from, I've seen RCTs being done in 6 months. So the important point is that you don't have to do a lot of if you want to look at malaria interventions and you know that the evidence on insecticide-treated bed nets is very good, you don't need to do the efficacy trial. All you need to do is to understand whether insecticide-treated bed nets are being adopted. And that's all you need to do in a 6-month trial, and what helps greater adoption. But you don't have to do an RDT after that. So that's one. So that's essentially in terms of costs and then also timeliness. Again, you can do them very quickly, like I said, and you can take 10 years. In climate, if you really want to understand their impact, many of them, if you're not looking at uptake, can take 20 years. But the last myth is that they don't have an impact, and that's the one I want to try and bust. Because again, the hypothesis is experiments or studies that use randomized controlled trials are not changing our behavior. And I think that's the part that we have to try and advocate against. When I was at 3i, they help to do two things. First, they help to measure how much, but for a lot of organizations, understanding how much that difference was not as important. So qualitatively, the result was that organizations that were engaging in RCTs were not learning as much from how much, but they were learning a lot more about the implementation from just implementing RCTs. How well are they implementing their program? What is their implementation fidelity? And how can they make their own organizational structure far more strong is what a lot of organizations who are not academic laboratories get to learn from RCTs. And that's what we took into LORTA. So we basically are using the fact that just by incorporating good designs and committing yourselves to doing RCTs, you will learn better organizational behavior, implementation behavior, and implementation fidelity.
So in many ways that let's say academic discipline actually impacts practice for those organizations directly. So, and I think we've all touched upon, you've both touched upon, and SSIR, we touch upon the importance of the intersection of theory and practice and how both play upon one another. I was thinking
Can I
about.
also answer your question?
Please,
May
no,
I?
mine, of course.
I'm interrupting you, but
That's the point of this conversation.
okay. Let me just share one story and then some deeper thinking about it. The story is the following. I went to Uganda. I had a neighbor next to me. I said, "What do you do?" And she said, "Oh, I'm bringing a lot of medicine to Uganda that is extremely useful." And I said, "What do you treat?" And she said, "Everything from HIV to malaria." And I said, "What medicine did you bring along?" And she said, "Homeopathic medicine." I said, "Did you ever check?" Of course we did. We asked them how they felt afterwards. So, what I really hate are these kind of people, quite frankly, because they are doing damage out of good heart. And this is the most terrible thing, if you think about it, that people do damage out of a good heart because they don't have knowledge, because they haven't done the RCTs, etc., etc. Now, what follows from that, of course, is you have to be hard-nosed in terms of the way you go about it, in order, and quite frankly, in the very beginning, before I started doing RCTs, I thought, well, I know that personal initiative is good for you. You know, why should I have a control group? You know, why don't I just, compare it to some other people, who happen to be around, and that's my control group. I mean, I sort of, this is not hard-nosed enough. You sort of have to say, it can also damage people. Whatever you're doing, it can damage people. And you have to worry about that. And therefore, one of the biggest things indeed is that that sometimes things damage. Yeah? And that you find out with RCT that they're either non-effective, but non-effectiveness means damaging because people at the end notice that it's non-effective and they say, well, training doesn't work, or this doesn't work, or that doesn't work. Yeah? So, but therefore, we need to have that. But I do think that we also have to have prior knowledge before we start with an RCT. And there, quite frankly, I find RCTs a bit too often too pragmatic. Oh, let's try it out. And, and look whether this works. And sometimes, this olfactory issue is fantastic. Now, I do happen to know that there is experimental data, but laboratory experimental data that show that olfactory stimuli are extremely strong. Now, quite frankly, I would not have thought about the olfactory approach to getting surgeons to wash their hands. I wouldn't have thought of that, but I knew the data on that. In principle, I could have said, yeah, olfactory stimuli, particularly in sexual behavior, is extremely strong. We know that. Yeah, we have experimental data that show that. Okay, so therefore, what I suggest is that you now comes the psychologist, that you do laboratory experiments before you start to do the big field experiments. And with the laboratory experiments, you can actually do a whole lot of good too, and that costs very little money. Yeah? With the cheap undergraduate students that we all have. Yeah?
That's a special message to any cheap undergraduate students in the audience, right?
No, I mean, it's very good for them to participate in the experiments because they understand the method. Yeah? So that's my take on it. We need to think before we do the big field studies, a bit more than we typically do at this moment. But on the other hand, I find it refreshing how economists are pragmatic. And they are sometimes more pragmatic than I would ever be, quite frankly. But it's also a refreshing interaction. So I love to work with economists in the meantime.
Yeah, I just noticed that I'm surrounded by two Michaels.
You are.
Yeah. You are. Okay, so I completely agree with that, Michael. Do the lab work and then think about the field studies, right? But I think for me the interesting thing is that a lot of the work that international organizations end up doing, first they don't align as much with universities as they should be to do the lab work, but they don't do the effectiveness trials. So yes, you can do the efficacy trial in a laboratory and you can think about, is lemon scent going to work or not? And you can do that in the field, in the laboratory. But take the example of cook stoves. Cook stoves is this, is this quintessential example of something that works in a laboratory. You can design it, you can get the smell, the sight, all of that to go and be culturally appropriate. And then you apply it on the ground, and 6 months later, attrition is just through the ground, right? And that's the effectiveness trial. So, yeah.
We were talking about the hand washing example, and Joe, you mentioned that the women's eyes, sadly, was the intervention that worked the least. And that reminded me, Michael, when I read your paper in Science, please correct me if I'm wrong, didn't it, one of the things you found that the personal initiative training actually benefited women entrepreneurs even more than, or women-owned social or enterprises more than men-owned enterprises?
This is one thing that we were extremely interested in, because actually the World Bank people I work with are in the women group, and they were particularly enthusiastic about the finding that women profited slightly more, but not significantly more than men. But the women had a bigger spread, so the business training for them had absolutely zero impact, while for males it had some impact. But this is all non-significant now, while the personal initiative training had an enormous impact. Now we have comparative data with some other randomized controlled trials, and there we see that it's the males who actually profit more from and that's significant in this case, from personal initiative training. We also, by the way, have randomized controlled trials in which we show that personal initiative training has no effect whatsoever on females in Ethiopia. And this is, for me, all important stuff, quite frankly. I get smarter. I mean, we then, again, this is the interaction. We immediately started to think, what was the problem? In Ethiopia, it was the problem of the trainers, we think. And so we did careful analysis of the training behavior. So we fortunately had some videotapes. So we analyzed the videotapes of those trainers who had a positive effect on the trainees, on the participants, and who had no effect or even negative effect on the participants. And we could show that the behavior in the training was different. But this is now exploratory research, completely exploratory research that now, again, you have to, of course, go and see whether that's true or not. But this is why I'm so enthusiastic about it. Also enthusiastic about the but it feels really awful when your theory that you love and published on goes down the hill, and zero effect. Come on, but it makes you smarter, immediately smarter, and that's what you talk about when you talk about the implementation side. The implementation side is not unimportant.
But also think, Michael, about you're thinking about, well, you had this hypothesis, and that was essentially contradicted, right? Or your prior was contradicted. But think about the millions and millions of dollars that go into supporting programs and interventions that are essentially not going anywhere and or have actually negative impacts, right? Community-driven development. One other example of where I think the World Bank and again a lot of international organizations thought even over the 80s and the 80s, 70s and 80s that if they put in money into social funds and community-driven development, and the underlying hypothesis being that you essentially give grants to villages and to communities, but predicate that on communities coming together and deciding together as to what they would spend money on. And the theory of change is that, especially in strife-ridden communities and communities that have witnessed a lot of ethnic conflict, forcing them to come together to discuss as to what decisions will be made together will help to create social cohesion. But community-driven development evidence has now, overwhelmingly shown that community-driven development programs don't help to enhance social cohesion. What they do help to enhance is public infrastructure. So if you wanted to build a school, and this is what people get together and decide, if you wanted to build a school or a clinic or a road, pave a road, etc., definitely public infrastructure does get enhanced, but it does not lead to increased social cohesion, and in many cases also has negative impacts. So work that's been done in Sierra Leone, Rachel Glenester, for example. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Joe, one thing I was impressed with was the use of data, especially publicly available data, the use of physiographic data. But then you also talked about the use of personal data for patients collected from wearable devices. And of course, we're talking about populations that have been exploited in many instances by groups who had control over data in the past. What are some of the, as you think about measurement, what are some of the ethical questions that are involved in the use of personal data or even in third-party acquired data?
Such a good question, and I'm trying to think of how I can respond to it intelligently, but Michael, please feel free to jump in too. Okay, so just so let me give you an example. Again, this came up because when I was in my previous position, when I was working at 3IE, we would give grants for impact evaluations that mostly had RCTs embedded in them, but they could also use quasi-experimental methods. And as head of evaluation and the deputy of the organization, a large part of the responsibility on understanding as to how we can and should be using data lay upon me. And so one thing was that, yes, we were governed and we put together, consent rules. So yes, you had to get institutional review boards or IRB clearance from countries. But the challenge is, and you're absolutely right to point to this, Michael, is that especially in developing countries, IRBs either do not exist or are extremely weak, right? You can go to Uganda and get an IRB certificate for $50. And that's not okay, especially if you're doing, data collection that requires consent from, under 18-year-olds and on sensitive data, et cetera, and health-related data. So this was a very big concern for us. I think, I have to admit, I think we punted that part. We essentially said, okay, if you're coming from a university, you needed to get IRB clearance from there, but you also needed to get national IRB clearance. We also made rules about how researchers needed to save their data, anonymize it, and to preserve the confidentiality of it. But I think a lot of it is so obsolete now, given what we have coming out from our personal devices. A lot of it is so obsolete, and I feel ill-equipped to think about it, primarily also because at GCF, this is the big problem we are dealing with. We are doing memoranda of understanding with universities as well as projects on the ground where they are being asked to provide us and share with us for co-using data that they are collecting. But we are bringing on then personal information data specialists to help us think through what it means to anonymize and to save data. So I'm going to essentially punt that question with one additional story that, for example, the latrine use data that I was talking about for open defecation. The plum data, so the passive latrine use monitor that essentially gets hung in a latrine, that made it very salient for me, and this is just about a year and a half ago, where we had to think about, well, how will that data be collected and what is consent, in this case. I'm going to put it out much more as a question maybe to you, Michael, and to Michael, and to see if we can get better answers than I provided.
Michael, any additional thoughts?
I have real difficulties with that question, quite frankly. Of course, there was one experiment that was done in the United States, and I don't remember anymore exactly what the experimental variables were, but it was sort of on people either getting money on welfare or not getting money on welfare. And of course, that meant that some people did not get money on welfare. For me, I have a different solution, and my solution is always not a randomized non-treatment control group, but a randomized later treatment control group. So the control group should get the effect later on, or should get whatever positive things I have available later on. And I think that's the weighting control group, I think, is a better strategy than the non-weighting control group, or the non-intervention control group. Now, quite frankly, I think that, and economists have argued against me on that point by saying, yeah, but the expectation already may change. And there I say, it can happen a little bit, but do you really think that if people expect that they get it in a year from now, a training that they don't know and which they have no idea about what it really implies? I don't think that that's much of an effect. But quite frankly, that's an assumption that I have not tested. Yeah? That you can test actually in experimental lab research, and I have not done it, but it would be something. So this would be my solution to some of that, because it's often the control group that is the ethically problematic group. The other thing with anonymity, that's a biggie, and it's a real biggie in terms of, quite frankly, we're talking about often formally illegal economic activities. Yeah? Informal sector is often illegal in most countries, yeah? Formally. And of course they don't want the tax office in their backyard tomorrow. Yeah? So the point is there you really have to watch out what you're doing. And the only, the trust issue is of course a bigger issue in developing countries quite frequently. Quite frankly, if a whitey comes to Africa, people trust this guy that he's not going to go to the tax office and tell them. But if a local person does the interview, they might. Yeah? And there's, of course, a lot of issues around that. And, of course, what you get is under-reporting of profitability. Yeah? So you actually get less of an effect size that you actually want. And so there's a lot of issues around that. And I can only say, this is a vast area where you have to sort of develop also experimental paradigms to check that.
I want to bring us back to the overarching theme of the conference and the question of collective impact. I'm going to steal a little bit of thunder from tomorrow's presentation on the topic of collective impact. One of the things that the FSG study says is crucial to actually implement collective impact is having a systems leader in place in your organization.
Having a what?
A systems leader.
Yeah.
And they talk about 3 of the traits of a systems leader, including big picture thinking, able to think beyond just their organization, but to see the larger issue, the ability to create partnerships outside of their own organization, and of course, innovative original thought. So, a couple of those very clearly reflect back to personal initiative, but Michael, I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more to the relationship between personal initiative training and developing a good systems leader.
I think I know a lot about change management. I've studied it. The data are lousy, but I have strong opinions on change management, and I do think that it's true what you're saying, that you need somebody who is a leader for the change management, who is a true leader, who is a charismatic leader, who has some kind of vision of change, etc., etc. And I do think that you can then sort of have a waterfall system within these kinds of organizations that where you institute sort of systematic actions that are related to what you want to change. So I do think this is possible. Quite frankly, it's one of those things where everything that I've done has always failed. And most likely it has failed, like I have a pet study that talks about how to deal with errors in an organization. And one organization, a big organization in Germany, said, oh, we really need to work on that. So I worked with all of them. I worked with the CEO, with the people below that, et cetera, et cetera. And then the CEO changed, and the next day this was gone. This idea that one should do any kind of change in this area was gone. And the new CEO said, we need to increase profitability, and all this other jazz we don't need, okay? The point then is, and quite frankly, it is so sad. We had a fantastic program in Liberia at one point in time for the university there, and it was really highly managed by a UNESCO, the UNESCO person responsible in the Ministry of Education. Leadership changed. That person she was fantastic. I mean, really fantastic. She was kicked out, because she was too fantastic, etc. Oh, it's awful. You see that again and again and again. And here, that's the end of psychology. This is where institutional guys have to come in. I have no idea about how to really start to institutionalize change issues. I know how to make it happen once it's there, but I don't know how this institutionalization can really work. And that's, for me, quite frankly, I want to learn from the economists on that. But they won't be able to tell me either.
And then yes, please, Joe. And then I have a separate question about measurement for you, too.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to add a couple of things to what you said. So you said big picture thinking, creating partnerships, and innovative thinking. And then I wanted to add 2. One which is persistence, which is a no-brainer. But the other one is something I alluded to as well, Michael, which is, because I think about this a lot. So just a little bit of context here. So my position, I report to the board of the GCF, is it's a 3-year term, and then it's renewable once. So I can only be at the GCF for 6 years as the head of the independent evaluation office. But I think a lot about what will keep a lot of the behavior that I'm trying to build in the system. And one of the things that is clearly coming out from the psychology literature, and I bow to them, is choice architecture. If you can create the structure that is appropriate, that will breed behavior. And so in small things and in big things, the structure breeds behavior is sort of the anthem that I've, instilled in at least my office. Right from our youngest interns to our senior most person, structure breeds behavior is basically the mantra that we write, right? And that means that in how the board takes note of evaluation. So we're creating a new institution. The GCF is a very, very new institution. It's about 7 years old. So it's also exciting because you have to build everything, but also know that it's like being a cowboy out in the West. You have to think about new things, but you can also create the organization in the vision that you assume that an organization should be. So it can you have that opportunity, but that structure and creating that structure now is really, really essential to then help create the behavior that you want. So whether that's in how the board signs off on documents and makes decisions on them, how we do partnership agreements, and how we are creating just the way our office is structured. All of that is really thinking about behavior at all times.
Can I ask a question to you? And what do you do if people are told to lie about geographic areas and impact of strong winds?
You mean while data collection?
Right. I mean, I'm giving the example that Trump made the statement that Arkansas was involved in the typhoon, and and needed the data to be adjusted. What do you do with that? So there's no
besides
choice
recognizing
structure.
that facts matter.
Right. Yeah.
But I think, Michael, it's the norm, right? It's the structure that you have to breed. It's the norm that you have to change. That someone like that should be made a social pariah. But except we don't have that norm right now. We do reward it with even more votes at the next election cycle. So you've got to change the norm, right?
Let's get off this topic because I'm getting a little depressed.
Sorry.
We're really sorry.
I know,
for
it's
you.
all right.
But it happens frequently in the area that changes happen that are politically motivated changes that actually change the structure again. Often.
So last question before we throw it open to the floor. I want to make sure we have a chance to get questions from the audience. I'm not going to do the question I was originally going to ask Jyoti. I'm going to throw a question out to both of you. So thinking about the tenets of collective impact, whether that's measurement and partnership and leadership, all kind of coming up with common goals, what is one thing from your work that you believe has a real lasting meaning or importance when an organization or a group of organizations are trying to come together to address an issue, to come together to collectively address a major issue?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Sure. So from your research, what is one crucial thing that supports the efforts of an organization or a series of organizations involved together in achieving collective impact?
I think I have one tentative conclusion. And the tentative conclusion that I have is that you should sort of allow whatever member you have in whatever organization you have to do useful experimentation of some form or another. And in a way, this is of course implied in the concept of personal initiative, that you don't invest all of your money in this one idea, in this one opportunity. You should always be clear that it can go wrong. And therefore, I think this is one approach that I think follows from my research, that you should allow in any organization to do this kind of thing. 3M, I think, does a wonderful job of that type as an organization. I think the World Bank is now doing this to an extent that is fascinating, and it's very difficult to see how that 20 years ago you would not have thought that it would happen that way. So this.
Yeah, and I can see how that would be when you're going into a process together. It would be hard to get everyone to agree to have that permission space for it. And Joe, what about, is there something specifically with regards to measurement?
Yeah, starting from where I left off, which is structure breeds behavior, I think the key recognition and the insight from that space is that social non-monetary incentives work. And we are seeing this. So when you come into group settings and collective action or potential for collective action, recognizing that in that sort of a gathering, social pressure but also social incentives and social recognition works very strongly. And in that setting, even if you're the one showing and demonstrating personal initiative, so you're the leader, be willing to walk away without the credit. Yeah. Because that, and then you can truly be ready, then you can truly get the group to work as a cohesive collective.
I think that's excellent advice for all of us. So with that, I'm going to steal a little bit of extra time. So questions from you in the audience. And I think, do we have microphones for? Yes, we do. So there's someone with a microphone there. So if you just raise your hand, I'll have the mic runner come over to you. And you can ask in whatever language you're comfortable asking your question in. We will pop our earpieces back in to hear the translation. I can't believe we covered everyone's questions. Here's a question right up in the front.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Christy Davis, Singapore Management University. And my question is actually on one of the last points you were making about having someone in the organization with a responsible person that is given permission to experiment. How do you recommend encouraging organizations that are not corporate? So it could be a multilateral, but it's those that are stewards of other people's money. They've received their funding from donors or wherever it is, and the bar for experimentation is like 1 centimeter off the ground. Any suggestions on that? Thanks.
There I would say that it would be useful to actually, if you want to do experimentation like in government or so, that it's much more difficult, I agree. Then I think it really makes sense to sort of go to the university and say, give me pilot studies of one form or another on this kind of thing, whether we can enlarge it. But even then, I do think that governments have to start. There's a wonderful article that said reforms as experimentation, that they have to actually sometimes get the idea that a reform needs to be reformable itself. So you sort of have to say, we have this reform now, and I do think that the United States has a very good idea about that they say, we have this reform for 10 years or for 5 years, and then we revisit it, like this tax reform or something like that. I think that's a very, very useful way of then approaching the scaling up of that. But I would do smaller studies beforehand and give money to universities to do that.
If you don't mind, Michael, I'd like to add to that. So there is, it's a phrase that has been coined by Marianne Mazzucato, who is a professor at the School of Public Policy at UCL, and it's called symbiotic ecosystem. Yeah, and which is essentially saying that, and she gives examples, and the book is wonderful. It's called "The State is an Entrepreneur." So, and she gives examples of course, Apple and Google, but DARPA and ARPA. So these are defense research organization in the United States that essentially created the symbiotic ecosystem where a lot of the high-risk innovation gets done by university professors like Michael. In laboratories or out in the field, etc. But the grants are given by the state, where you're essentially saying, yeah, we'll come in with the $1 million and do what you need to. So, like the Genius Awards, etc. But as soon as some of them are past the innovation stage and then they come into the VC stage, so where venture capitalists are willing to come in, then you've got to think about opening this where development and research can create that ecosystem. So I think There are, and again, these examples are not just in the United States, they're also in Europe. KFW, GIZ have done a lot of work in that space. And that's essentially one of the other ideas we're trying to push GCF into thinking about. Be innovative, have an innovation hub where you're also working very closely with the innovators, but taking the risk. So that's why I presented the idea also of the impact bond. You know you want the innovation, you just don't have the capacity to do it in-house because you'd have to start a university. So use what you've got out there.
Other questions? I see one back here.
Hi there, I'm Zahin. I work here at the Hanyang University. I have a question related to this behavioral change kind of topic. So this morning I was listening to Ryan Hoover, who wrote the book Hooked, and looking at how, in terms of choice structuring, we can create behavior change. But then there's also the aspect of autonomy and awareness of the individual towards the choice. And I'm very curious what your thoughts are in terms of, especially with regards to the personal initiative training, how much is that really raising awareness levels, or the level of awareness and autonomy of the individual versus simply restructuring choice in a way that we cause societal behavioral shifts, if that makes sense.
It's a paradox in and of itself to tell somebody show more initiative and be self-starting. So how can you deal with this paradox? And I take this to be part of your question. The way to do that is by saying, show more personal initiative, but I don't tell you in which way and how and for which kind of goal. That you have to decide. But I show you that whenever you do want to do something, you have to sort of be whatever, self-starting, overcoming barriers, long-term oriented. So that would be my message there. However, you also sort of implied, is there something like generalizing? Is there a generalization that comes out of it? Like, are people who show a higher degree of personal initiative, are those also the backbone of civil society in the future? Do they behave more ecologically, et cetera, et cetera? All of these kinds of things. And the general answer is training is always specific. So we thought that people would have a higher say-so, you know, like female entrepreneurs, after they got personal initiative training, have a higher say-so in the distribution of money in the family. They don't, quite frankly. That's not the change. The only thing is they have now more money, because they make more profits as female entrepreneurs, and that they use. They don't have more say-so in the family. Now we're looking at precisely that in a new project that we're hopefully starting with the World Bank in Congo, where we do look at that specific issue as well, this more generalized empowerment. In general, whatever you want to do is, whenever you want to do anything in any place with regard to structural changes or with regard to individually based changes, in any case, these will always be specific issues, versus the hope that this is all generalizable is most often disappointed, quite frankly. Is that an answer?
All right. Well, with that, we've gone a little bit over the time that we had originally allotted for this session, but I want to thank all of you for your attention and patience, and I would like to thank Dr. Joe Puri and Dr. Michael Frese for your time today. Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much. I think we're going to lunch next, and we'll see you there and then in the afternoon session.
Thank you, Michael. You were great.